Welcome back to This Week in Immigration. I'm Jordan Lapierre. Theresa and the gang are taking a well-deserved week off from the show, so we're dipping into the archive this week. The Trump administration continues to push for reforms to the legal immigration system and points to so-called merit-based systems like those in Canada and Australia as models. So let's go back to 2018 and a conversation between our Theresa Cardinal Brown and representatives of the governments of those two countries. The first voice you'll hear in this clip is Theresa, followed by Michael Willard, then Assistant Secretary of the Immigration and Citizenship Policy Division of the Australian government. Then you'll hear from André Valotaire with the Embassy of Canada, and finally Daniel Griswold, a Senior Research Fellow at the Mercatus Center.
I'm imagining that a lot of people really don't know much about the Canadian-Australian system. If they know anything, they probably say, oh, it's points-based or it's merit-based, and what does that mean? So, Michael, let me start with Australia. We're going to go in order, alphabetical order of our Commonwealth friends here. Tell us a little bit about the Australian system. Would you describe it as merit-based? And how do you go about selecting immigrants? Is it just points? Are there other criteria? In 3 to 5 minutes, condense it in.
Will do. Thanks, Theresa, and thanks for the invitation to be here. And I should point out I don't come with a migration prescription from down under for the US. I'm just here to talk about our government system, which of course is designed for Australia, and hopefully can inform you a little bit more about our system. We are, and that's partly because that's a diplomatic thing to do, but it's also because we are very different countries, even though I think you could say we're three of the major modern immigration countries. We do have very different systems. A couple of things that strike me that are very different between our countries are the proportion of overseas born within our populations. So in Australia, that figure is over 28% of our population is overseas born. From OECD data, I understand the figure in the US is more like around 13%, and I understand Canada is somewhere in between those two, around 20%. So that's one difference, and of course there's many others, not least the way in which immigration rules come about in our respective countries. And we operate under a Migration Act of our Parliament, which allows our minister to make regulations that set the rules for how visas work. And again, different system in each country. But in terms of our immigration program, there's essentially two large components. One is our migration program, which is currently set at a ceiling of 190,000 places for this year. We also have a humanitarian program, which is set around 18,000 places. I'll focus on our migration program and the different components there, because as we work towards this idea of merit-based immigration, I think what we're talking about is probably the skilled migration component of that program. And our skilled migration program is 128,000 places of that 190,000. The remainder go to family migrants, which are mostly partners, but also parents and other family migrants. Now, our program is described as a hybrid program, our skilled migration program. We have points-tested components. That is individuals without a specific sponsor who are entering on the basis of their skills and attributes, to which we have allocated points, and essentially the highest scoring people are those who are the first ones invited to apply for a visa under that program. But we also have a very large employer-sponsored cohort within those 128,000 places. And we also have regional cohorts. Now, in Australia, migration is the responsibility of our Commonwealth, of the federal government. So there is no constitutional right for our states to manage any component of migration. But our system is set up in such a way that the states each have capacity to nominate migrants to come to their own states. And that's the Commonwealth has used its powers to set up the system to allow states to do that. So there's also a component there for states, and there's also an element that tries to encourage regional migration. So provides concessional entry for people going to particular parts of Australia. Those of you familiar with Australia will know we have a very large percentage of our population is urban and a large percentage is on the eastern seaboard. So people willing to migrate to other areas who are in need can migrate under concessional basis. Within that skilled component, so we have that points-tested category, we have the employer-sponsored category, and we have the state or regional sponsored categories. We also have a business innovation investment program. That's about 7,000 places out of those 128,000 places. And that's really an element that a lot of governments around the world are trying to grapple with, is to how do you attract entrepreneurial talent. And many countries have programs. Most of them are fairly new. I think it's very hard to tell how many of those programs are going at this stage. And finally, we have a very small component, 200 places, for distinguished talent within our program, which is your Nobel Prize winners or perhaps Olympic athletes, particularly in Australia's case. So that's the basis for our program. I thought I'd just very quickly point out a couple of trends in our program that have occurred over the past couple of decades, and then perhaps leave it to everyone for conversation. And those trends are, we've moved from a program that was dominated by family reunion to a program that's now dominated by skilled migration. So that the breakdown is roughly 2/3 skilled migration, 1/3 family reunion. Now, 20 years ago, 25 years ago, the breakdown was very heavily weighted towards family reunion. So that's been a shift over time within the Australian program. Another element that's worth pointing out here is that we're talking about permanent migration programs, but of course, with the advent of globalisation, what I think every country is seeing is the number of temporary migrants is increasing much more quickly than the number of permanent migrants. So the question of how you manage temporary migrants and how you manage their transition onto a permanent visa or not, as the case may be, is a very much a topical question for Australia. If you look at the rate of growth of our temporary cohort, and we're talking temporary workers, students, work and holiday makers, that's growing far faster than our permanent cohort. Many have aspirations to move on to a permanent visa. How do you accommodate that, and how do you control that? Is another key question for us. Within our skilled cohort, we used to have a large proportion of points-tested migrants. We now have a growing proportion of employer-sponsored migrants. So we went from predominantly a human capital skilled program to a program that's now balanced between human capital and demand-driven migration. So there's some of the key trends. I'd point out that our system is designed to respond to economic need. So there are a number of levers built into it that will adjust automatically in line with what our labour markets are telling us. We also tend to make changes to the system fairly regularly. So it's always a work in progress because we're trying to align it with what we think Australia needs. So I might stop there as a brief introduction, but welcome discussion later in the day.
Thank you very much. André, so around here, people talk about the Australian and Canadian systems like they're interchangeable, but clearly there are differences. Michael pointed out a couple of them, but talk to us a little bit now about the Canadian system and how you balance the skilled migration, family-based, humanitarian, and your system.
Merci beaucoup, et merci beaucoup pour l'invitation. And I promise I'll do the rest of the presentation in English, but I wanted to point out one of the fundamental specificity of our country. It's a bilingual, and very much our immigrations also in every aspect of life takes this into account. And I guess I won't have to remind you because you'll hear it from the accent, right? So one of the important distinctions with Australia is that right from our constitution, this is a shared responsibility between provinces and territories and the federal government. So the management of immigration in Canada is very much a partnership with the province and territories. And it involves also a lot of local and regional actors. And that has been a key success, I think, for our program, is that it's very much built on partnership. Also, as part of that responsibility for the province and territories, because Quebec is a French majority, then it had obtained, through a special accord, special powers under immigration. So they select their own economic migrants, and also they're responsible for the integration to make sure they can integrate to that distinctive society. Our program also, our immigration program, is very much a manage and balance program. And it has been since its inception. So balance because it's not just merit-based, which we refer to as economic migration, but also give a lot of importance to family reunification and to humanitarian program. So the humanitarian will include, people we give protection as per international obligation and refugees that are resettled. So the merit-based or the economic migration is only about 58 to 60% of our program. The rest is divided between family reunification at about 27%. It changed from year to year, but that's about the numbers. And mostly focusing on the nuclear families, so children, dependent children, spouses, and some number of parents and grandparents. And the third component, the humanitarian aspect, is 15%. And it's been fairly steady over the years as well. As Michael had said, we have about 20% of our population that is foreign-born, and that's growing. And that changed also because and they've been settling quite well. It's been a success in our immigration, and 88% of them become citizens at the earliest possible time. And our goal is to make them full citizens as quickly as possible. Another aspect that is important for our overall immigration program is the integration. So we want to make sure that people integrate, and the federal government is spending over $1 billion per year in settlement program, which is then supplemented at the provincial territorial level, and as in the US, with interaction by civil society and other stakeholders. Also, the annual targets, that's how we call it, we go and present them in Parliament every year. So it has to be approved by Parliament. And this year they will be at 310,000. And out of those, 177,000 plus will be economic migrants. In the economic migrants, a little bit like Australia, we don't have only a point-based system. So we have various streams under the economic migrants. One of them is provincial nominees, and it's basically the provinces nominates people who they want to come to their jurisdiction. And that's recognizing that they're the best place to know what is the needs they have regionally and locally. So that allows for that movement that is specific to the needs of one area of Canada. They nominate. We still do the admissibility, so ensuring that they can enter Canada and they don't pose a threat. So that's, again, the partnership is present there. We have also a little component of entrepreneurs, but that's very small. And the rest is federal economic program. So there's a federal skilled worker, federal skilled trade, and then Canada Experience Class, which is to recognize people who have worked in Canada. And that goes through a point system. The point system gives points, as in Australia, towards human capital, but also range employment. And it's quite balanced. It's a hybrid. We went from years to years changing, between the two. We started with purely arranged employment, then switched to human capital, and now it's an hybrid. And we monitor constantly the outcome of immigrants and adjust the system as we go. And what was found is that while arranged employment has the best outcome in the short term, over the long term, human capital is better to move the economy towards growth and innovation. I think I will stop for now and then welcome a question after that.
Don't worry, I'm taking copious notes. There'll be lots of questions. So Dan, I think many of our audience who are familiar with the American system already have noticed some differences and similarities, but why don't you talk a little bit about what your research has shown and sort of how we differ from those, and what would be some of the challenges if we were to do this?
Yes, and thanks for the Bipartisan Policy Center for inviting me here and these distinguished guests. That was a great Super Bowl ad for Australia tourism.
That's right. That was good. How many saw that?
Maybe want to book my ticket there. Maybe even emigrate there. I don't know.
I have to admit, I groaned initially thinking they were remaking Crocodile Dundee, but it turned out okay.
That's great. Well, I've come to lavish mostly praise. I think the comparison between the United States and the Australian and Canadian systems is welcome, maybe not for the reasons that some of the people trying to compare them intend. I'm going to talk mostly about the positive elements of their systems that I think we can learn from, and maybe do a little bit of nitpicking on what we may not want to follow as fully. The theme seems to be more rather than less. More employment, skills-based immigration. Both countries, their overall immigrant pool is about 60% employment-based. Ours is 14%. We're overwhelmingly family-based. They were kind enough to let me put up some charts here. This really tells a story. You know, I think to talk about immigration, you really have to look at it as a rate. Both these wonderful countries have populations that are about a tenth of ours, if not less. So when they let in 300,000 immigrants, it's going to have a disproportional impact on that country as opposed to ours, a country of 325 million. And what you get from this chart is it isn't that they are more stingy than we are in allowing family-based migration. They're actually about the same on a percentage. It's just that they are overwhelmingly more open to employment-based migration. If you look at the chart, family-based immigration, that's the second, the bottom bar is humanitarian refugees. The middle bar is family-based migration as a share of the overall population. In both the United States and Canada, it's about 2 family-based immigrants per year per 1,000 population. In Australia, it's 2.5, so fairly similar. The huge difference is in how much more open they are as a share of their population to employment-based immigration. Of course, we're mostly talking skills-based, college-educated, skills-based immigration. In Canada, and these figures are 2013 to 2015 based on the OECD. They were the latest numbers I had. This is straight from my study for Mercatus in October. In Canada, it's 4.5 employment-based migrants per year per 1,000 population. In Australia, it's 5.5. In the United States, it's 0.5, half. So 9 times as many employment-based migrants to Canada as a share of their population, 11 times in Australia. Canada's even upping that now. You heard their annual targets. They'll soon be 1%, or the overall migration numbers. They're more than twice as open to immigration as a share of their population. When Canada follows through on increasing their annual targets, that's going to get them up to about 1% of their population per year in immigration coming in. That's almost 3 times what it is in the United States. If we had the same proportional immigration allowances as these 2 countries do, we'd be letting in, instead of 1.1 million green cards a year, we'd be awarding 2 to 3 million per year. And it's sustained over time. This isn't some new turnaround. You heard them both refer to the foreign-born population as a share of the overall population. They were exactly right. In the US, it's about 13.5. Canada, it's 20. Australia, it's 28. But this just shows you the trend over time. That has been a fact going back for almost 3 decades, and the trend in all 3 countries is up. But we're not getting any closer to them. They're more. If we're an immigrant country, they're an immigrant country times 2. The composition of the immigrants with Canada, it's pretty remarkably similar. Are the top 4 source countries for permanent immigration. Three of the countries are similar for the U.S. and Canada. It's the Philippines, China, and India. We happen to have Mexico for obvious reasons. There it's Pakistan. Thank you. Australia is a little different, China and India, but also for historical ties, Great Britain and New Zealand. And I'll just end with this observation, then I'll get into my nitpicking. I think by any measure, these are 2 successful, pluralistic, democratic countries with thriving open market economies. And those higher levels of immigration don't seem to have caused them any problems that should make us hesitate to increase our overall immigration. I'll just close on a couple of nitpicky things on the point system. Well, first off, in this country, I think when they talk merit-based immigration, it's a bit of a code word for reducing overall immigration numbers. If you look at the merit-based point system in the RAISE Act, for example, it's very restrictive, more restrictive than these other 2 countries that they're hold up as an example. There are some problems that I've read about with a strict merit-based system. One is screening. Immigrants have an incentive to maybe exaggerate their language or education skills. It's required governments to do some third-party checking. If you rely on employers have the greatest incentive you can think of to make sure somebody's got the right credentials because they're hiring that person. There can tend to be something of a mismatch between the skill sets of the immigrants coming in and what industry needs. And in both countries, you've tended, at least in the past, to have a little bit of a higher, say, unemployment rate among skilled workers than in this country, because when they come in, they pretty much by definition have a job. The numbers can be a bit mismatched. You can have an oversupply at times and undersupply in others. You're hearing that in both those countries, they're moving more towards, I think they both use the term hybrid system. That would be fine, but I'll just end on a kind of a philosophical note. I tend to have a preference philosophically, but I think based on experience that a more bottom-up system relying on the market signals of hundreds of thousands of employers and what kind of workers they need tends to give better results in terms of matching immigrants with the opportunities here than a kind of top-down government-managed system where people in government with good motives, but not always with enough information, are trying to decide what kind of immigrants we need. So I know both the United States and the European Union tend to have more of a demand-driven, employer-driven system. So I would just say let's fully embrace our friends in Canada and Australia in the example they set in terms of the numbers and tilting more towards more employment-based, not cutting seriously family. But I'd be hesitant to embrace a merit-based system. I think a employer-driven demand-side system is better. Thank you.
Thank you, Dan. All right, so lots of food for thought. I'm going to ask some follow-up questions. So one of the questions I have for you, both Michael and André, is, again, in this conversation of merit-based, as I mentioned at the beginning, merit-based doesn't have a defined definition in immigration law in our systems. And I think you both mentioned that your skills selection process, it's not just about the individual skills, but there's also a component of what your country needs, right? So there is that sort of, looking at the economy. So how do you define skills? Is it just, you have to have a graduate degree or PhD or education level, but what if you're like a highly skilled technician, or you're just in an occupation that's heavily in demand that may not require a lot of education or work skills? Michael, do you want to talk how you balance those needs?
So our Bureau of Statistics does a lot of work on labour market statistics, and as part of that work, they do a job of classifying every occupation in Australia. I think there's 1,200 or so occupations that are classified. That includes a broad indication of what educational qualifications would be required to undertake that job. And our migration is focused on the skills end, so there are 5 classifications, and ours takes people down to what we call skill level 3, which is really you might say 2 years of post-higher education training. This could include a trades field, and it could include most professional jobs. On top of that, we have our equivalent of Department of Labor, I guess, who look at, do a lot of modelling and look at what is the long-term need in terms of these occupations. So that sits on the points tested side. We also have the employer-sponsored side, which is more filling short-term needs in the economy. And that's really driven by employers, I think, as Dan talked about.
That can be at any skill level, that employer-driven?
It's still only skilled migration. We've got some programs at the unskilled level, but very small programs and with a lot of controls around them.
And do those require a labour market test? The employer has to first test to try to see if they can find Australians, or is it sort of a given that certain occupations are going to be in short supply?
Yeah, the labour market testing process is actually currently being expanded. It used to be just at the trades level. It's now being expanded to professional levels as well. It's focused on the temporary side of migration, so temporary employer-sponsored migration is where the labour market test occurs.
Okay, but on permanent migration, not necessarily.
There's a range of requirements. There's not so much a labour market test, but there are requirements that go to salary level, and the government's very keen to see a situation where migrants aren't displacing Australians. Migrants are complementing Australians in the workplace.
Right. André, in the Canadian system, how do you regulate between sort of, as you said, the human capital and what Canada's economy is demanding?
Yeah, similarly to Australia, then we have a lot of studies that are looking at what are the longer-term needs of the economy, and that more in the highly skilled, or the skilled occupation. I shouldn't say highly skilled. We go into the management, and it's National Occupation Guide for us, but the professional level, the management level, and then the skilled trade to be able to meet those demands. And that's, people have to be in those occupations to enter the point system, if you want to say. But the provinces and territories, through their nomination, can also, and they do their own research, and they can also nominate people at lower skill level, if that's what their regional needs are. And for example, in Manitoba at one point, they needed people to work in their meat packing industries. So they used a nomination. And that's the flexibility in the system to allow that, while the federal level programs are looking at the longer term needs. And there is always the possibility for the employers in either system, either in the provincial nominee system or in the point system, to make an offer of employment. And that will give more points to, and then ensure the people can go through the system. So that's how we manage it, the balance between the two.
So Dan, I was just going to turn to you. Like I hear this, and it seems they both talk about managed systems. Yeah. A lot of governmental actors here, a lot of statisticians and labor markets, and a lot of sort of the government figuring out what's needed, provincial or federal. Our system is very different. It's pretty much congressionally mandated at the legislative level. The numbers are set in statute. We haven't changed them in 30-odd years. Yeah. How would we manage this?
And so much has changed in those 30 years. Yes. Well, first off, I want to pick up on the Canadian provincial system, because there have been proposals in Congress to have some state-based visas here in the United States, which I think is a very intriguing idea and would allow the states that see their need to respond to that. But yes, our Bureau of Labor Statistics also goes through an exercise where on a periodic basis, every year or two, they'll try to project 10 years out the growth in particular job categories. And I'll just say the record's mixed on that. It's just, again, I don't question anybody's motives. I just question the ability of governments to anticipate the needs. There are whole job categories that we couldn't even think of 25 years ago, and others that were prominent 25 years ago that have completely disappeared. And so I really think we are better off relying on private industry. I have to say, we do have a kind of hybrid system here in the United States, in that if you look at the H-1B visas as a kind of probation for transitioning to green cards, There, of course, we have generally a requirement that you have a bachelor's degree. And I was glad to hear André say there, especially through the provincial system, there is an opening for lower skilled workers because, and I like what Michael said too about immigrants complementing Americans. We tend to have a demand for immigrants on the high end because there just aren't enough Americans with PhDs in the STEM subjects to feed industry. But we also have a demand on the lower end where the number of Americans who've traditionally filled these low-skilled jobs continues to shrink because we're getting better educated. And a merit-based system might overlook that entirely. And of course, that's what drives illegal immigration. We don't have sufficient legal channels for people to come in at the lower end. So you put all that together, and I think we can pick and choose the better parts of their system, including their overall openness to more immigrants, but not adopt wholesale the merit-based system for all the reasons I mentioned.
So I'll go back to our foreign friends. So in terms of measuring the success of your migration programs, you know, we tend to look at a lot of public pollings. You both mentioned that you look at sort of the success of the immigrants themselves and integration, whether or not they become citizens of your country, those kind of things. But how do your governments respectively measure whether or not they think their program is successful, and how does that play out?
So there's a couple of indicators in Australia. We run what we call a continuous survey of Australia's migrants, which looks at, this is purely labour market focused. It's about economic migrants or economic impact of migrants, and it looks at their circumstances in the labour market over 6 months after their arrival and then 18 months after their arrival. And that's published on our website, and there's a lot of interesting information there about the different streams that we have. There's also this is a non-government entity, but a well-established survey conducted by the Scanlon Foundation in Australia that looks at attitudes towards immigration. I guess tracks how the Australian public feels about immigration over time, and that's been running for over 10 years now. It's an annual survey, which is another good piece of information. The government also, similar to the Canadian model, every year has to bring the migration program forward to Parliament, usually in our budget process. And as we do that, there's a period of consultation that involves public consultation around attitudes towards the program and what the composition should be and what the numbers should be.
André, how does Canada evaluate?
It's very similar. We use different sources, but they're very similar. So yeah, every time we bring the admission plans to Parliament, then we'll have a broad consultation, first with the province and territories, but then with all relevant stakeholders through Canada to gather what they think should be the needs. That would be employers. They will look also with the civil society. They will look at the municipalities. They look at the education stakeholder, because as you grow your population and you get more immigrants, you have to ensure that there's room in the school, and it's all organized that way. So there's a lot of polling in that goes directly in those consultations before we bring a plan to Parliament. And last year was the first time that we didn't go only with an annual plan. We went with the 3-year plan. And that's recognizing as well to give more flexibility to all the actors in society to plan ahead. So not just year to year, but know that in 2 years' time, there'll be that many immigrants in 3 years' time. So there's that process. We have also an annual survey that takes that is done by the government every year and polls the opinion of Canada. It's at least once a year. It's often done on a more frequent basis if we feel that there is a need, that there may be something happening that we need to get the pulse of Canadians. And in the latest one that we have done, everybody, a large majority was supportive of higher level of immigration and in the 3 streams. So we looked at the 3 streams: humanitarian, family, economics. There was broad support. And then we have the measuring of outcomes of immigrants, and that's done through a linkage between the immigrant data with the tax data. and it measures the income of immigrants after a year, after 2 years, after, and even the second generation afterwards. And to measure what has been the success, it can drill down by age, nationality, education, categories, and it allows us to know if we need to adjust the system. And that's one of the things also that we have, similar to Australia. The minister has the authority to adjust the point system very easily or to introduce new program as required.
So Dan, I don't know about you, but the idea that Congress would vote annually on our level of immigration to this country, as hard as it is for them to take one vote on one tiny part of our immigration system right now, I mean, what strikes me very much is just the level of intentionality in these programs. That the government's not only propose every year, they look at what might be needed, Parliament gets a say, they poll the public, and it's intentionally managed. Our system has been pretty much set it and forget it as far as Congress goes, right? They pass a law and like, okay, go for it, and it just stays in place forever until something changes or is a need to change. What's your sense about whether or not, again, sort of a little political guesswork, could we manage such a system in such a way?
Wow. This might be the upside of a parliamentary system, that they're maybe a little better able to deal with these questions. Yeah. Our system has some significant advantages in terms of checks and balances, but it does make it difficult to handle this. And that's why I wouldn't want to see a commission or something, because yes, it might free Congress from its gridlock, but I don't think it has the information, the flexibility to respond to the market. So I don't have a quick answer to that. Political scientists do, but I think we need comprehensive immigration reform in this country. I don't think we should do it under a 2-week deadline leading up to a continuing...
Probably not the best time if you're going to be thoughtful about your process like the Canadians and Australians.
I will just respond to a couple of things. I think in terms of public opinion in this country, we've always been ambivalent about immigration, haven't we? We're very proud of our immigrant heritage. We're always a little uneasy with the current wave coming in, whether it was the Irish 150 years ago or the Italians, and now predominantly Latin American, but I think Americans do tend to support comprehensive immigration reform in the sense of legalizing the dreamers who are here. They want to see a solution to that. They want to see adequate checks to make sure terrorists and criminals don't get in. They want immigrants to work and not go on welfare. I think those are all reasonable expectations. And then in terms of measuring the success of immigrants, no, we don't have a particular government agency charged with doing that. We have had a couple of very thorough National Academy of Sciences studies over the last few years. One, I think, in 2015 on sort of the cultural aspects, 2016 on the economic consequences of immigration. And the conclusion, and these are distinguished panels of experts across the spectrum, was that the immigration assimilation experience in the United States has been largely, if not overwhelmingly, successful. Immigrants learn English. Their children are almost invariably fluent in English, bilingual. By the third generation, forget it. They're just speaking English alone. The United States is a big assimilation machine. We're still known as the graveyard of languages, and that is working. In terms of economically, immigrants are contributing significantly to our economy, in particular the high-skilled immigrants. We need more of them, not fewer. So again, I think our experiences are similar, even though our systems and our history are somewhat different.
So Michael and André, both of you mentioned some changes over time that have been implemented in your system. Is part of those changes as a result of some of this surveying and data? And what do you think may be some of the next changes that are being considered? I think Dan mentioned that Canada's looking at increasing the targets. What are some of the changes forthcoming for your systems?
Sure. I mean, yes, the changes generally respond to what we see in the program. I guess if you look at recent changes, there's been a slight increase in our English language thresholds for skilled migration, and they apply across both the points tested categories and the employer sponsored categories. And there's a wealth of data and research on the importance of English in terms of a determinant of migrant success in Australia. So we're often adjusting. Another significant change is the introduction of a system called Skill Select, which is our system which captures expressions of interest from potential migrants. We then issue invitations to those migrants to apply under the points-tested categories. What that lets us do is vary according to occupations, the number of invitations we issue, the respective scores that we set for different occupations, and that's about being able to target a program and control a program according to whatever labour market needs there are. More recently, the government's introduced some changes that will be taking effect fairly shortly around our temporary employer-sponsored categories. And these go around more targeting. I guess they were far broader in the past. They'll be more targeted and the criteria will be raised slightly as well. But that's just a couple of things.
André, it's kind of looking at.
So, yes, the continuous increase in immigration, and so trying to aim at 1% by in 3 years' time, and in all categories. So all categories are increasing in number at the same time. One of the things that, based on the measure of success, the earning incomes in that study that is ongoing, one of the things we change is in 2016 in our point system, we decreased the number of points given to arranged employment because we found that it was then giving us mostly lower skilled occupations, and we're not getting the high end. And so we're getting people from the food industries and cooks and all that, which, we said can go through the provincial nominee system. We want to have the human capital, and so we adjusted the point. And all the research that had been done on the longer longitudinal studies shows that really the arranged employment has really a good benefit in 1 or 2 years in the longer term. What drove the economic growth and the innovation and the best success of immigrants was the one with the higher human capital. So we changed those points. We also adjusted, so the system gets to be adjusted to meet other needs of the populations as well. So one of the needs, and it's a government priority, is Francophone community outside of Quebec. And so we gave more points now for knowledge of French in our system so that, these get selected and we'll have more Francophone immigrations.
So just to be clear, so you said Francophone outside of Quebec. So Quebec selects its own immigrants.
Yes,
and
people
apparently French is very big in that selection, I'm sure.
Yes.
But if somebody wants to settle in Saskatchewan or Yukon Territory and speaks French, they can get
extra points. We also adjusted to give points to siblings for having siblings in Canada. And that's recognizing, and it's not a lot of points, but that may make the difference if you're invited to apply or not. Recognizing that siblings may be assisting you in the integrations and all that. And again, responding to the populations and what the polls has indicated. They says we want to have that possibilities of having our brothers and sisters. We don't want to go to a family reunification system, but we recognize that in the point system. So we adjust constantly.
So just to be clear, on the family reunification side, you can't necessarily sponsor your sibling, but if you're coming in the point system and you have siblings already in Canada, that can give you extra points. So there's a family component even in the skill selection process. Okay.
And in general, you raise a good point, is that when we talk about point system, if you look at our overall immigration, there's only about 20% that are selected on points. Because when you calculate and the family reunification, the humanitarian class, but also the dependence of the people who are selected on points, these ones are not selected on points. So it's really 20% that we select on point. And it didn't change the fact that overall, all immigration categories have been contributing positively to the economy and to the society.
That's our episode for this week. Thanks for listening. We'll be back in 2 weeks. In the meantime, please take a second to find us on Facebook by searching Bipartisan Policy Center or on Twitter at BPC_bipartisan. And don't forget to subscribe and leave your feedback on this podcast on Apple Podcasts, Google Play, Stitcher, Spotify, or wherever you get your podcasts. Just search Bipartisan Policy Center. I'm Jordan Lapierre. This Week in Immigration was created by Theresa Cardinal Brown and myself. The executive producer of This Week in Immigration is Theresa Cardinal Brown. This week's episode was written by me and produced by Chris Ramon, Yafet Tawahara, and me. Our editor is Yafet Tawahara, and the executive producer of BBC Podcasts is Ashley Swearingen. That's all for now. Join us again next time on This Week in Immigration.